This episode of Tales from Atlantis is brought to you by Atlantis Premium. Don't you just hate having your favorite podcast interrupted by ads like this? Well, dear listener, you're in luck. Because starting at just $3 a month, you can support independent Chicano media and receive ad-free episodes, premium episodes, bonus content, and access to our Discord server. Just visit talesfromatlantis.com and click Go Premium, or follow the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show. This episode of Tales from Atlantis is brought to you by Atlantis Premium. Don't you just hate having your favorite podcast interrupted by ads like this? Well, dear listener, you're in luck. Because starting at just $3 a month, you can support independent Chicano media and receive ad-free episodes, premium episodes, bonus content, and access to our Discord server. Just visit talesfromatlantis.com and click Go Premium, or follow the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so, and 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 why that's so.
Yali no chime, and welcome to Tales from Atlantis, the show where we explore Mesoamerican pseudo-history, New Age nonsense, and other stories of adventure. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa
and Ruben Arellano, also known as Tlacatecat.
Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Tales from Atlantis. This is episode number 20, the final episode of season 1. So to everybody who's been listening this far, I thank you for giving us a shot, and we hope you've enjoyed season 1 of Tales from Atlantis. My co-host, Ruben Arellano Tlacatecat, is busy. Today, it seems that school at the university is about to start back up in Texas, and he is busy trying to get all of his classes together, so he will not be joining us today. But I am joined by two guests. So we're switching it up. We have two guests today, two friends of mine, who I hope you will enjoy. The topic today is bad Nawatl, and what can we do about it? So joining us is Yan Garcia, the author of Learn Nawatl, the language of the Aztecs and modern Nahuas, which is now in its second edition. And I got to tell everybody out there, if you haven't gotten this book yet, you need to go out and get it. This is my go-to book for studying modern Nahuatl of the Huasteca variety. And I really recommend that you get this. So thank you for joining us, Yan Garcia. Also joining us today is Dr. Magnus Hansen. Magnus is an assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen and a professional linguist specializing in the Nawatl language. So, gentlemen, thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank for having us.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course. So today we're going to be talking about bad Nawatl, and this is something that I see a lot because, coming out of the Mexicayot, I was introduced to a lot of really bad Nawatl from a young age in my teens. And, I didn't know any better, right? So I had these people that they presented themselves as native speakers of Nawatl, and I didn't know. They sounded legit. They looked legit. I was going to these ceremonies. But later in life, I started realizing that the stuff that I was learning was not really grounded in any sort of linguistic reality. And then now with the advent of social media, we get all of these memes and videos that are passed around online. And, I'm not blaming people for sharing these things because they probably don't know any better. They have good intentions. They want to share the language. They're proud of the language. They want to pass it on to others. But the problem with a lot of these memes and videos is that it's not grammatically correct Nawatl, or it's Nawatl that, doesn't mean what they think it means, or it's Nawatl that was completely made up. And you see a lot of that coming from the MCRCA and early Mexicayot organizations. So, Yan, you had made a video recently where you tackled this subject. What was how's the response been to that video?
I think it's been pretty good. A lot of people said and commented on that they were looking for something like that for some time now. And, I get messages all the time from people who say, finally, I see now that's actually spoken, and it's not just, chants or songs, which are great, but oftentimes in early times in the social media, that was all that was available when it came to Nawatl. And little by little, you're starting to see more of the actual Nawatl and how it's spoken. Just a few people who, of course, you're going to have cognitive dissonance when you've grown into this and you've been using these words all your life. And for someone to tell you that, hey, by the way, native Nawatl speakers don't use it, or it doesn't mean that, or it doesn't mean what you think it means, or it's not actually a word, it's not going to be easy for everyone to respond to that. And so oftentimes not everyone's going to comment that and, and talk about how they feel in that sense. But, a few people will do that.
So was there any word in particular that people pointed out, like, man, that one tripped me up? I had no idea that word was incorrect.
I think it was just the general, everything in general. No one said specifically, this is the one thing that I got, but there's just so many examples. There's just so much stuff that's constantly out there. One of the things that you might notice is that it almost feels like, we're working against a giant wave that's pushing against us, because, the stuff that's not real and has been around so long is just so easy to just put out there into a meme, and given the right aesthetics or whatever, it'll be compounded and multiplied. And that's what people will end up seeing, the stuff that's easy to make mistakes on, easy to repeat. It's almost like the more fake something is, the more likely it is to be out there. So we certainly have a lot of work ahead of us for, what we're trying to do is promote the language, revitalize it, encourage people to speak it again if it was part of your heritage, part of your ancestry, or if you're a lost diaspora native from Mexico or Mexican ties, it makes a lot of sense, I think, to regain this language and bring it back. But it's unfortunate, the first people who started with trying to promote the language, maybe in the 70s and 60s, or even before that, they had a shaky foundation, and everything's been built on top of that foundation. And, as much as possible, it's best to make these corrections, as hard as it is for some of us to accept sometimes. But, when you start having the future generations, think of a child who might be given a name by birth. And in the future, maybe they'll find out that it's not, legitimate name. Well, how's that going to be good for the movement? How's that going to be good for encouraging the child to continue down this path, thinking about our future generations? But there's a whole bunch of categories I can get into in a bit, but there's different categories of these words. There's different patterns I've noticed in how you can categorize these mistakes.
So Magnus, in your work, and I know that you do a lot of research regarding Chicanos re-identifying, reconnecting with their indigeneity and trying to learn Nawatl. Are there words that you've come across that are glaring examples that Chicanos seem to get wrong a lot? Because I know I've gotten quite a lot wrong in my efforts to learn Nawatl.
Well, I think I'd like to start by saying that really I think that all Nawatl is good Nawatl and any Nawatl is good Nawatl. So I don't want to be a judge of what is and isn't good Nawatl.
Good man.
I think the thing is it's good that it's being spoken, right? But what is sometimes bad are claims about Nawatl that end up being false, right? So when people take on an authority to say that this is the right way, or this is the true way, or this is the way it's supposed to be, or this is the true origin of something, and when it's maybe not. I think those to me are the more problematic things. How people pronounce words, or if they give them new meanings. I think, well, go ahead, do that. As long as you don't go and tell other people that they have to use it in that same way, right? Though to me, some of those claims that sometimes come out of the Mexicayo movement is more problematic to me when they start telling, for example, even sometimes now speakers from Mexico who grow up speaking the language that they're doing it wrong, right? I think that is the real heavy problem, because it's actually a hindrance for making the language stronger. Because you don't make it stronger by going around pointing fingers at people and saying that they don't speak it right.
Yeah, to native speakers.
So to me, those are the things that I reacted more strongly to when I found those claims, right? And that could be, well, one of the things that I've always sort of railed against is the idea that now documented in the colonial sources is the real Nawatl, and what is spoken in Mexico now is sort of a degenerate, debased version of that, which is both untrue and also a very
well, it's insulting, right? Yeah, it's a very colonialist idea to take.
Yeah, it is. So those things are what I've mostly been annoyed at. But then sometimes you also get certain things that sort of seep into the way that the language is used. So, for example, historians will often, because they read Nawatl from books, but they don't hear it spoken, so they'll have some like very some pronunciations that are very close to the letters as you would read them in English or Spanish, but not the way that they're supposed to be pronounced in Nawatl. So you get a very common pronunciation, for example, of the word for Lord, which is written, of course, T-E-C-U-H in in one of the common orthographies, and many historians and other people will also pronounce that as Tecutli or something like that. But really, since there's no U vowel in colonial Nawatl, that U represents just lip rounding on the K. So it would be pronounced as something like Tecutli, but probably more likely as Tectli. That's how I've heard that word pronounced by native speakers, for example. So that pronunciation can get a little bit heavy. It has a whole extra syllable, right? A whole extra syllable and a vowel that doesn't exist in the language. And then you will get people like even correcting other pronunciations. So it's Tecutli or whatever. And that gets
well, if you look at like the word Motexoma, right? Yeah. Or Montezuma or Motecuzoma. There's like, I've seen at least 3 or 4 different ways of writing.
Yeah, that's a famously problematic word, right? Because Montezuma, with that N that comes in from nowhere, became very widespread very early.
And then Moctezuma, Motecuzoma.
Yeah, and then you have the one with the K switched in front of it. Yeah. So of course, some of those go back like way to the actual moment of colonization, when Spaniards just didn't know how to pronounce things. So you get the Guatemus for Cuauhtemoc and Moctezuma and all those weird names, and Temestitan for Tenochtitlan and all those.
Well, I've noticed that one mistake a lot of people make when they're making claims about Nawatl, and I see this a lot, in particular from people who've come from the Mexicayot. So when I first got involved in Mexicayot, one of the first things that I heard or that I was taught was that Nawatl was outlawed by the Spaniards, right? That our ancestors were punished for speaking Nahuatl, that the speakers were, you'd have your tongue cut out. I heard that claim made, that they would cut your tongue out if they caught you speaking Nahuatl or singing Nahuatl songs. And this just, it's factually incorrect to make that assertion, right? Like, that's simply not true. They did not outlaw the speaking of Nahuatl. In fact, the Spaniards needed that language because they were using it as a tool of conversion. They were using it as a way to communicate with other indigenous peoples. Even if the other indigenous peoples weren't Nahuatl speakers, they would rely on people who spoke Nahuatl and another language to act as interpreters. So the idea that Nahuatl was outlawed is just not true. Do you want to expand on that?
No, in fact, yeah. So in fact, as you say, it has never been outlawed as such, and especially not in the colonial period, because in 1570 Felipe II even decreed that the use of Nahuatl should be the official language of New Spain. So it was actually made an official language in the period. Then later on, it was made unofficial again, but it was still used in a lot of official capacity. So it definitely wasn't outlawed in this period. Of course, what we maybe are mixing up a little bit is, of course, we know that they burned a lot of books in indigenous books, right? And we may have the idea that these books were written in Nahuatl, then that they were burning them because of the language. But these were, of course, mostly pictorial codices that didn't directly encode the Nahuatl language, and they were burned because of the pictures, because they were considered to be idolatrous pictures, not because they had a connection to the language.
Well, there's that one famous image of the priests burning the codices, and you could see spirits, right, coming out of the burning books. So there was a reason. The reason they were burning those books, they were religious reasons, not because of the Nahuatl language. So I think that's an important point.
What is slightly where it comes to be a little bit more correct is if you think about Nahuatl now, of course, thousands and thousands of Nahuatl speakers have grown up being punished for speaking Nahuatl in school. So from the 40s and 50s on, maybe even earlier, since the establishment of the school system in Mexico, school teachers have punished children who spoke Nahuatl and discouraged them from speaking. And that is absolutely true. But that's the last 100 years, more or less. And that, I think, is probably the main reason that Nahuatl has become a declining language in the way that it has. So this part of it is true. But it's not true that it was so in the colonial period, because in the colonial period, indigenous people in Mexico were organized into these what they called Repúblicas de Indios, which were basically self-governing little republics that would have a lot of freedom to organize themselves and speak their own language. They could even have scribal schools where they taught how to write their own language, only as long as they communicated with the Spanish colonial administration in Spanish, usually, right? But within the republic itself, the indigenous languages were always allowed.
Yeah, and sometimes people conflate that with the experiences of the Sioux people and the Lakota and people in the north, where there was a lot of banishing of the languages, but also again in the school system, when there was a policy of whitewashing everyone and assimilation, basically. And so that goes in hand with the same experiences in the schools in Mexico, except in Mexico, it wasn't through the Catholic Church most of the time, but through government-sponsored, government-run schools that, again, had the policy of trying to assimilate everyone and to speak Spanish. So that I see conflation there happening too.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Have you picked up your Mexica calendar for the year 12 Flint? Or how about a paperback copy of The Four Disagreements? Just visit talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise and show some love for your favorite podcast. That's talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, I think both. So both in the U.S. and Mexico, this is a 20th century phenomenon. This idea of assimilating the indigenous populations by force and by taking away all their ties to culture in all of those horrific ways that this has been done from boarding schools, which were also used, although not a lot, in Mexico. And just general discouragement and prohibition of using the language in official capacities. But this is a 20th century phenomenon mostly.
Yan, you had mentioned that you had made a list of some of the common misconceptions or mistakes people are making when they're approaching the Nahuatl language. The first thing that I see, just to start us right off, is the mispronunciation of the TL, right? So you'll hear Nawatl, Quetzalcoatl. They make it rhyme with bottle, like axolotl. And what it does is it creates two sounds instead of one, right? The TL should be one sound. So do you want to, and the way I tell people to do it is if they put their tongue to the roof of their mouth and breathe out the sides, that's probably kind of close, right? Nawatl.
Yeah. I can coach most people to get to it, when I'm working with people in person. And, so I know a lot of techniques about, how to look at what people are doing with their mouths to try to get them to help them do it. Other people who struggle will just get it after practicing with us for some months, and it'll just click at one point. So almost everyone who I've worked with will get it at one point. And like Magnus said, there's many correct pronunciations and many correct Nahuatl. So when people can't say the TL, we say, it's also acceptable just to say T, tlacat or tacat. There are varieties that say that. Even within the Huasteca, there's a couple of towns that say that. So it's not wrong to have to say the TL. In Michoacan, you have the West Coast varieties that say L instead of that. So lacas. And it's a different kind of L still. It's kind of like the Navajo shla sound, tlacas, that you'll get. That kind of sounds like a T in a sense, but it's just that L with the air coming out of it. But yeah, we coach people to get through that sound, get the TL, and it is kind of like a T, the plosive sound, happening at the same time that you're having that kind of L sound together. That L sound, your tongue is in the position of an L, but you're not voicing it like an L with your throat. Instead, the air is coming out the sides of your tongue. So it's like, pretend you're making an H sound while your tongue is making an L sound. And that will help you get that L sound. It's kind of like a slushy L that we say with kids when we work with kids. It's kind of like that lisp. That's the lateral lisp that some kids have in school, the sl sound. Except, so there's that thing we help them out. But that one, at least, that's a pronunciation thing that people get after some time. In English, I get it, when people say axolotl, because they're speaking English, not speaking Nawatl. You're speaking a different language. That's why they call it the Klamath River instead of the Klamath River that had the TL sound originally. But the Anglos couldn't do it. They heard it as a K. So when people are trying it, sometimes they'll pronounce it like a K sound. So people might say tlacak or siwak, like a K sound, when they're starting to learn it. So we just say, just do a T sound or we'll coach through the TL sound. But when it comes to pronunciation, what does come up often, and you'll see it in spelling, and this kind of I'll put a little bit of the blame here in the Spanish language. It's no fault of its own, but the Spanish language usually only has the ch sound. It doesn't have the sh sound anymore today, the ch sound, unless you're in the northern parts of Mexico. Of course, there's going to be exceptions, but so we get confusion between when is it and when is it the ch sound. So you hear a lot of the elder, like the Chicano elders, you could say, that they'll say mexica for mexica, right? Though that's how you'll hear a lot of older people say it. I think a lot of the younger people, even in Mexico, in the city, are getting better at making the sh sound when they're saying mexica or mexicas. But there was a lot of confusion, and that leads to confusions between the word chocolate, like chocolate, which Magnus has a great article on why it's chicolat or chocolat in some varieties. But again, because people think, oh, now it has an X everywhere, so people will have a tendency to put that everywhere. So instead of recognizing that the word was spelled chocolatl and chicolatl in a lot of varieties, it's like, oh, it must be with an X because everything in Nawatl has an X. It looks cooler.
Right, the X makes it real.
Kena. And people, when they're saying the word xochitl, the flower, right? If you speak Spanish, then you know my sister's name is Xochi, you know, and that's how we pronounce it because that makes sense in Spanish. But if you're going to speak it in Nahuatl, then you want to try and make the native pronunciation. It's xo and chitl. And beginners will have difficulty with that because we want to assimilate those two sounds. We want to say xochitl or chochitl, one or the other. We want to make it everything in X or make everything in CH. And that's when it gets tricky, where we have to keep in mind in our head, within the same word, there's two different sounds, xo and then chitl. And I'll see mispronunciations for chili, which people say is chili, spelled with an X. But chili is a kind of crayfish in a lot of modern varieties, not chile. Right? So you have chili and chili. Those are different sounds. Misspellings of chicome with chicome. And I don't, almost no variety will say chicome for chicome. So that's the categorization I'd see of pronunciation errors in Nawatl.
Well, one thing I tell people is that xochitl is actually a really good word to master because you get the sh sound, you get the ch sound, and you get the TL at the end, right? So if you could say xochitl, that gives you kind of a good framework of how the language works and the sounds the way you're supposed to move your mouth when you're saying the sounds.
Definitely has all the tricky parts into it, all in one.
That and, Tlacashipe Walistli. So.
Yeah, you do have to train yourself to memorize long patterns of sounds, long sequences.
For sure.
So another thing we might talk about is that, like the agglutination part, because it also does sometimes lead people astray. So you get people to think that, because Nawatl is an agglutinating language, so that means you can just stick anything together in any order you like, and then you have a new word. And that's not exactly how it works, right? Because it has some very strict rules for how to stick things together. Because if you don't have strict rules for how you do that, then you can't interpret new words. So a Nawatl speaker wouldn't be able to understand a new word without having understood also the rule for how it's strung together, those different parts. And it works both ways. So sometimes it's very enticing for people when we try to understand a word to try to cut it up into bits that we can understand. So you get, for example, the name of the deity, Tlaloc, and you'll get people saying, okay, so Tlal, that's earth, and Ok, that sounds like the word for pulque. So it must originally mean earth pulque, and then you can invent sort of a way for how earth pulque makes sense, if you want, right? But really, just because you can cut something into pieces doesn't mean that it's actually made of those pieces, right? So many Nawatl words are very long, and you can segment them in different ways. So if you don't respect the rules of the grammar that was used to make the word, so you can segment it in different ways. If you want to, and make up fanciful new etymologies for words.
Yeah, well, this one linguist was very kind when I was young, and I was like, yeah, well, Tlaloc, that means licor de la tierra, right? Like, Tlali and Octli. And he just looked at me and he's like, well, I would consider that more of like a folk etymology. That's what he called it, a folk etymology, and he wasn't judging, but he was like, nobody really knows what Tlaloc means. There's some hypotheses about the word means, but he wasn't able to tell me. He told me he believed it meant something that lays on the earth, maybe like Because it's the rain, right? Tlaloc is the rain.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Have you picked up your Mexica calendar for the year 12 Flint? Or how about a paperback copy of The Four Disagreements? Just visit talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise and show some love for your favorite podcast. That's talesfromastlantis.com for all the latest merchandise. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, that's another way to cut up that word, and it's absolutely possible. I think it's probably more possible or plausible than the pulque etymology. But really, yeah, they could be correct, but only one of them would be correct, though, I guess. But also, it could be a complete word, a name. These deity names are very old, and they can have been carried over from a different state of the language where it didn't come from either of those roots that you can cut it into now.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a word, right, in itself, without any deeper meaning.
And this tends to happen easily in Nawatl because those long words that agglutinate, like Magnus said. And the other thing that goes with that is that Nawatl has less consonants than English does. It's got like 16 consonants. English has like 25. Nawatl has like 4 vowels. English has like over 10. And so it's very easy to make these assumptions where you see these pieces and words and think it must break apart into that, just because you recognize that word as a beginner without understanding how the word works together, without understanding the rules that go into play for all these things. So having more consonants, by the way, doesn't make a language better or worse, in case anyone gets that interpretation. It's just, the tools the language chooses to use, or it just happens to come across. But, you can have like tlazocamati, and you'll see this very commonly where people will think, oh, tlazo sounds like tlazotla, and there is a connection in there. But then they see the kama, and they see, oh, well, kama means mouth. And then they see the mati, and they know mati means to know. So people will think, oh, so it must mean to know someone's love through your mouth or something like that. You can piece this together in a billion different ways, or to love someone's mouth.
That sounds really dirty, by the way.
It can. So it's just the way people make these interpretations. And, obviously that word wouldn't even be that. It would be tlazocamamati, first of all. So it wouldn't even be the right word. And the other thing is you can't just stick those two things together. So you have to have a good understanding of the language from the base of how things are put together and expand once you get to higher levels, because it's going to be put together in ways that are very different from English or Spanish. It's not just put things together and there you go. It's not just Lego pieces. But what are you going to do? Are you going to take a class in Nawatl and, hope you have a good teacher that explains these things to you at a beginner levels where you dedicate all this time to it? Or am I going to go with the meme I just saw on Instagram or something that broke it down?
It's a lot easier to go.
It's a lot easier. And it sounds authoritative. So
how would you break down the word tlazocamati?
So the mati does mean to is often used in compounds for to know, like asikamati. Asi means to reach, to alcanzar, like you reached a place, right? Completed something. And then mati is to know. And I think the glue there you can talk about is the ka particle there. And so you have something similar there with tlazocamati. I'm not sure if it's using tlazo, as in the verb form of tlazoa, or if it's using the noun form of tlazotli. But it's definitely following the same pattern of asikamati. What do you see there, Magnus? Is that, you think that's tlazotli or tlazoa?
Yeah, I think the ka, I should say, is now it works sort of as a ligature, but I think it's really the same thing as the preteriod agentive key or morpheme. So I would take it from something like tlazoki, something that is loved, or from tlazoa, as you say, the verb tlazoa, and then you get tlazoki. And then when you put a key form together with a different verb, it always becomes ka. I have an explanation for that, but it doesn't really matter. You see it, I should say, in asikamati. You see it in Mohkatsatsi to me to scream in fear. So mohki is someone who is fearful, and tsatsi screaming. But when you put those together, you get mohkatsatsi. So you have those. It's a grammatical process, right? That when you glue things together, something else has to happen. And that's one of the reasons that you really need to appreciate the grammar a little bit before we start interpreting new words or building words out of
another one I saw was tlacuache, where people said it means small things that eat fire. Small thing that eats fire. And it's like, well, yeah, there's a story about the tlacuache, and it brought fire to the people and its tail got burnt in that process. That's a real thing, but that doesn't mean that the word breaks up into that. You'll see it has nothing to do with the word fire in there. It doesn't fit in there. And it doesn't mean eater, like fire eater either. And so you see this all over the place. Chihuahua, Nawatl. Another thing is you have to pay attention to the vowel length, right? So most books modern books, my book didn't even talk about it because it's not really important in modern Nawatl. There's very few words where it matters. But in older Nawatl, they made sure to sometimes even they would include letting you know, hey, this is the short vowel, this is a long vowel. And that does make a difference. When you interpret something like the word Nawatl, does it mean Nawiat, four waters? That sounds cool, you know. Everyone talks about fours, the four directions, and water, because there's water all over the place. It's very easy to lead yourself down that path, and people teach that still. But, you know, the truth is sometimes not as sexy as that. Or maybe it is, depending on how you perceive it. But Nawatl is a clear sound. And when you look at other languages,
the truth is always sexier than the made up stuff, man. I'll always go with the truth over the made up stuff.
Good, right?
I like it.
Yeah, well, I should say more like the things that are easier for people that fit in with people's perceived notions, I guess. But a lot of languages will call themselves.
So what you were saying about Nawatl meaning clear sound?
Yeah, and that's pretty common along a lot of languages, you know. Our language is either related to our state or identity, you know, or our language is going to be called what's understood, you know. What I can understand is Nawatl. What I don't understand, that's mumble, that's popoloca or something else, or some language associated with them.
So what about the word chichimecat? Because that's one word that I see people throw around a lot. And I've mainly seen it broken down as either chichiltic plus mecat, right? So mecat being rope, so meaning like lineage, and then chichiltic meaning red, so like the red lineage. And then I've seen that expanded upon as like, well, it's the red road, and they start trying to associate it with like northern natives following the red road. Yeah, and then the other breakdown I heard was just from chichit, like dog, right? And mekat, so like the dog lineage. So what?
So I'll let.
And I don't think either of those are true.
Yeah, so I'll let Magnus talk about the mekat. I'm just going to mention is like you want to look at the patterns of how other people are named, right? Before you just break something down now without understanding the context, at least there's the language, sure, but there's also the context. Look at how other people are named by the Nawas. The Masawa, their name is the owners of the deer. The Tepewa, the owners of the hills. Okay, so there's a certain constructions you see when how the Nawas refer to the people. Then you have, like the people who come from a certain town names. That's very common, like Zapotecatl, person from Zapotlan or Zapotlan. Mixtecatl, person from Mixtlan. There's so many names that that have that tecatl ending. And that's the most common pattern, person from this town or person from this political entity, or you could consider like a tribe that holds the people together. So that's the pattern you're going to see. Mekat, and then the Mekat, Magnus.
Well, so just as you have the one you mentioned, with where you have a place name that ends in tlan, and then you have the name of the people who come from there is Tecatl, right? So you have Mish Tecatl from Mixtlan. Well, then you have a very few but important place names that end in man. That's another locative ending that is used on place names. And when you come from a place that ends in man, then you're not a Tecatl, but you're a Mecatl. So, for example, someone who comes from Olman, the place of rubber, is an Olmecatl. And if someone who comes from Acolman, which was the place where they had the big dog market up in Tlatelolco, is an Acolmecatl. So by that extent, in extending that pattern, then a Chichimecatl would be someone who comes from Chichiman. And that is not, I believe, a place name that's actually attested. But so you'd have to back form it or reconstruct it based on that word if you wanted to say that Chichimecat means a person from Chichiman, which I think is a plausible explanation. So it would be a person from the dog place or the place where dogs are abound. On the other hand, and this is the dog lineage interpretation, to me, is not completely implausible for two reasons. So you do have the word Mecatl to mean lineage. So Tlaca Mecatl is a lineage of people. You talk about all your ancestors going back as like a rope of people. But then you also do have a myth that's pretty common in some different Mesoamerican peoples, but specifically I've found it to be common in the west of Mexico, among the Coras and the Huicholes, Huiraricas, which has a story about how after the deluge, when the world had been flooded, the world had to be peopled again, and it was peopled by a man and a woman who was actually a dog who had taken the shape of a woman, and all people in that story come from this primordial couple of a dog woman and a man. So that would sort of lend a certain credence, that story, to the idea of having a lineage that is part dog. And I think we probably, when we think about dogs, it sort of has a very pejorative connotation that I don't think it would have had necessarily, or probably in olden times in Mesoamerica, where the dog was an extremely important animal that had a lot of respect around it, really, in a way that it doesn't have in English. So I about the word Chichimecat, I would not discard either of those interpretations. They can both be, well, one of them can be correct.
So the two that you're talking about are people from Chichiman?
Yeah.
And then the dog lineage?
Yeah.
Okay. And so there's one word that I love because you see it pop up all the time in the Mexicayotl, and that is tiawi, right? And you see this all over the place. It's like almost like a vámonos, right? Like, let's go, let's, adelante, it's Mexica Tiawi or Tiawi Mexica is almost like saying Viva la raza, but in Nawatl is kind of the way it's caught on in modern use. But the way that I understand it is, well, at least in the Huasteca, I think that Matiacan would be more in line with saying, like, let's go forward or let's go as a people. So where does Tiawi come from? And how should it be used?
I'm not sure about the origin of it. You just, it's more about how it's used. So the grammatical equivalent to tiawi in Huasteca would be tiowi. And you do say that, tiowi, but not as a command, not as like telling people we should do this. It literally means we're going or we will go. So that's how it would mean. We are going, tiowi, with an H at the end. to imply that it means us, not you. So if someone uses tiawi in that sense, it would make sense to me grammatically to say it in that sense, like saying like we're going, as a statement, like, we're getting ahead, we're going along, we're going, we're going. So if you interpret it as that, then it makes sense to me. But it's not a command. It's not saying let's go. Let's go would be matiyakan. In most varieties, it'd be something like that, matiyakan. So that's how you would use that in that sense. Matiyakan, let's go. So it just depends how you use it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because that's one of those words that raises a lot of points of contention. Because I know that, who did they attribute it to? Was it David
Vasquez?
David Vasquez.
Okay, it may have been.
That when he was involved with a poetry group, that there was a strike going on at that time, like a student strike, and that the students wanted like a slogan to rally behind, but they wanted the slogan to be in Nawatl. And so the legend has it, right? I mean, I wasn't there, but that he introduced, Mexicatiawi as the way of, not that he invented it. I'm not saying he invented it, but I'm saying that he introduced it. He popularized it amongst the Chicano community.
Yeah, I have heard that as well. But again, since it was just through things I heard, I haven't been able to confirm it. But that's something I heard, and I'll say rest in peace to the man who passed away earlier this year. Yeah.
Yeah. It's sad to always lose a teacher,
and
he was a cool dude. I got to meet him because of Magnus.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to remember right now if he said anything at that meeting about whether he had used that phrase in the early days of his work, but I don't remember.
I don't remember him saying it specifically myself.
About it.
But it might have not been on his mind because not everyone was just using it then, that moment.
Yeah. So Magnus, Yan had brought this up earlier with chocolate. I did read your paper where you give a very compelling argument that it should be chicolat, right? Chicolat.
Well, not that it should be, but that it probably originally was. And it's not my argument. It's an argument by Karen Dakin and Søren Wichmann, who are two linguists who argued that in a paper about 20 years ago. I think that is the most credible etymology of that word, because the other one that people tend to give as bitter water, bitter is shokok. So you could maybe think that shokok at could become, or shoko at could become chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
It's often used as a sour, right? There's a difference there between sour and bitter, between chichik and shokok.
You're right. Yeah, sour. So it's sometimes translated as bitter, but of course, because that's how the chocolate is more bitter than sour. So exactly, one of the arguments against this etymology is that it's not a bitter tasting drink or a sour tasting drink. It's a bitter tasting drink, so it wouldn't work. It's not chichigat. It's so, and also you have actually a word chocolat, which is a sour drink made of what are they called? Ciruelas. What are they called? Prunes, plums, right? They're like plums, right? Sour plums.
A type of native fruit to the Americas.
Yeah, and you can make a certain water made out of those, and that is sour, but it's nothing to do with chocolate. So those are some of the reasons why the etymology with shoko doesn't work, because that would be sour water, and also because all of the places where the word is documented, it's documented as Yan says, with a ch sound. So it's either chocolat or in some places chicolat. And so what Karen Bacon and Søren Wichmann argue is that the Chicolatl, the Chicol is a sort of a stick with a hook on it that you can use for different purposes as a tool. And there's arguing that probably this kind of Chicol stick was also used to make chocolate drinks foamy. So you would call it the Chicol drink, the Chicol water, what the when you'd make the chocolate foamy with the Chicol stick.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's necessarily the best interpretation of the origin of the word, but what I do know is that it's there are places where it's called Chicolatl. The only time when we get a ch sound in Nawatl is when it is in front of an I, an E, originally, historically. So almost all ch sounds come from the sound t before an E. So tsi would be to become ch, chi. And then what also happens is that when you have an I in one syllable and an O in the next, then very often you get the I becoming O. So, for example, you also get that in grammatically, so that what's a good example? So where the T, for example, becomes to. So you have, for example, if you have a verb that starts with tikon, will do something to something. Tikonitas, that can become very like regularly tokonitas. So the E is colored by the O in the next syllable. So you get that a lot, and you especially get that a lot in the Eastern varieties where short E and short E will become take on the sound of the next vowel in the next syllable. So Chicolatl could become chocolat very, very easily. But chocolat with a sho, that's just nothing to suggest that it ever was that.
That's probably the most common interpretation that I've seen as far as like meme Nawat goes.
There's a chocolate company now that's selling chocolate with X, right?
Most of them do. Most chocolate companies do nowadays. If they're selling as artisanal.
Cashing in. Well, so I wanted to run a word by both of you, and I'm going to get into some words that I encountered as an early student of the Mexicayotl and get your guys' feedback on some Nawat. I have this book called Mexicayotl, which is attributed to Maria del Carmen Nieva Lopez. It was probably written by Rodolfo Nieva Lopez, but it was published after his death. He was the founder of the MCRCA, one of the fathers of the modern Mexicayotl movement, and they published this book. And it's just full of really bizarre pseudo-historical claims. But one of my favorite pseudo-historical claims is that the ancient Nawas traveled to Egypt and took culture and teaching to all the people of Egypt. But in this book, they introduced this word, and I'll read you the quote. It says, Los Egipcios, how do you say Egyptian? Egipcios? Los egipcios llamaron Atlantes a los nahuas porque cuando les preguntaron de dónde llegaban, contestaron con la expresión Atlantique, right? So, que en nuestro idioma quiere decir vinimos por el Atlántico o sea el mar. So, for our other non-Spanish speakers like myself, basically what this saying is that the Egyptians referred to the Nawas as Atlanteans, right? As Atlantes, because when they asked the Nawas where they came from, the Nawas responded in Nawat, Atlantique, which is supposed to mean, we came from the place of a lot of water, or from the place where there's a lot of water. So obviously not true, but where would you even get this word? Like, how do you think they're trying to break down Atlantique? Because I've also seen it as Atlantico, depending on who's writing the story. So it's changed through time.
They're trying to add "tic" probably. They're probably trying to add "tic" at the end of Atlantic. But you can't really do that. You can't put "tic" at the end of Atlan. The "tic" basically makes things into an adjective.
Atlantiaque.
If you want to stretch it, you could find something like Atlantiaque. We went
in the water, yeah.
I mean, you could stretch this a million ways. As much as you can get creative, you can make up different ways. But if you're conforming yourself to the way that the grammar works, it's pretty obvious. It just doesn't make any sense. You'll never see "tic" after a location ending like "tlan" to fuse together into one word. It just doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely one of the words where you get like, this is amazing that it means having to do with water, and it sounds like this, like, and of course, like when you have so few sounds, as you say, there will be these combinations that just reoccur and give you an idea of something. It must mean something like this, and then your associations start running, right? And that one is just very interesting, right? And there's another one that always comes up is the Teo, right? So Teo, which means deity or whatever, how you want to end up translating that word, but it sounds sort of like Dios or sort of like Greek Theon, right? And then you even have like Theopan, which is in Nawatl originally means like at the god place, that like a place where you would worship. Theopan, which was used for churches primarily, and then that sounds quite a lot like the syllables of pantheon in Greek, just reversed, right? So you get these odd combinations of words, and this is the stuff of folk etymology, and it's also the stuff of these linguistic conspiracy theories where you can make up stories about ancient travel based on just the likings of words. I have a friend. I'm from Denmark. And I have a friend, and he's a storyteller, and he loves telling stories about any place in the world that has the syllable Dan, D-A-N, in it, and say that those were Danish people who went there long ago, and like there's a place in South Korea that has Dan in it, and he said the Danes went there and they founded this place, and he'll make up the date and stuff. So you can do those things all of the time, and it's in a way very satisfying to make up the stories, but not if you, as you say, if you want the sexy truth of things instead of whatever you can make up yourself. Right?
Yeah, well, I'm going to throw 4 words by you guys. All of these I heard in ceremony, by the way, when I was active in the Mexicayot.
Okay.
One of the first words was that Citlali means, it comes from Se Tlali, the first land, because our ancestors came from the stars, right? And what I like about that one is when I bring it up to people, they're like, well, you know, Carl Sagan said we're all stardust and we are in the stars. So technically, and I'm like, yeah, but that's not what they're saying. In the ceremony, they were saying specifically our ancestors came from the Pleiades and came down. And that's why, it's called, the star is called Citlali because it comes from Se Tlali, the first land. So,
well, those are the first words people learn oftentimes. When you're learning Nawatl or exposed to it, you're going to be exposed to words like Tlali, land, and Se. And so you're going to see those words everywhere. Everywhere you look, you're going to see those words. But like Magnus said, a lot of words in Nawatl are made up of smaller pieces. That's very true. But there comes a point in time when you can't break it down anymore. And it looks like you could if you really forced it, but it would be like, it'd be silly even to do it in English, Like we don't do that in English. No one even tries to. Because we know how ridiculous it can get up to a certain point. Like history doesn't really mean story. It doesn't break down into that,
His story.
Right. People do that as a point to say, hey, history has often been told by men, and that's very true. That doesn't mean, a lot of people would say, oh, obviously no one will believe that. That people really believe
there's
that.
Some people that do, though.
You get everything in these days, but it's very easy to do that now when you don't speak it fluently. And so I don't, as far as I can tell, you can't break that word down anymore. That's the smallest. Sitlal, and then in is the ending there.
Mm-hmm.
And Nawaz
just star.
Yeah, Nawaz don't confuse Sitlal with Setlal. That's not even a common thing in modern varieties.
Nice. So the other thing I heard was that Seattle comes from Se'atl, one water, because it's always raining there. And that the story I was told was that, well, the Nawaz obviously went to Seattle and gave it its name. And that's how we get Se'atl, the one water, because it's so wet. What do you think, Magnus?
It's a no for me, as they say. Well, I was just now looking up, because of course I don't remember the specifics of the way that the town of the city of Seattle was named, but I believe it was named after Chief Sealth, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering the language there. But he was a chief of one of the Suquamish or the Wamish people, and it was his name, I think, that was used to name that town. So in that way, that would be a weird way of appropriating a place that belongs to the people who we know have lived there for a long time, and it was named in the honor of one of their leaders by people who, of course, there are probably Nawatl speakers in Seattle now, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't when the city was named. Yeah.
And then I'm going to comment that really quick on that. Notice how disrespectful it is both to Nawatl and to the native people of that land when they appropriate like that. For when people are not understanding the culture in which Nawaz name places. Obviously, Se'atl doesn't have the ending location.
Yeah, it's just water. It's not a place name, and you would never name a place like just a town
like that. Never. And so if you look into the basics, that's in the first chapter of learning how to put town names together, And if you live in Mexico, you see Tlan, Can, Pan all over the place. Cool. And you'll never see just Seat, Anyways, I just want to mention that.
Thank you. The other one I heard was that Nacatdoches came from Nacat and Tochtli, which just on its face is pretty ridiculous. I don't even want to talk about that one.
Same thing, place name. All the place names have the same errors here. They don't at least even offer the place ending name.
And then the other one is Michigan, which I heard claims that it comes from Michoacan and then Michihuacan, and it's like a place where there's a lot of fish. But I think that's just a coincidence in sounds, and that it does not have any basis in reality. In fact, I think it comes from like Michigan, like the people, the indigenous people that live there.
Something like Big Lake or something like that in one of the Algonquian languages. I'm not completely sure which one, but it would make a lot more sense for it to be an Algonquian word. And the meaning Big Lake is also more, well, I'm sure there's fish there, of course. But that doesn't matter much. You also have to show that there were Nawatl speaking people there at the time when the place was named. Because otherwise it just makes more sense to go with whatever the people who actually lived there called it.
Are there any other words that you've noticed, Yan? Like you, just in terms of stuff that sounds alike, or
there's a whole category of just the wrong meanings, right? So you have words that either are Nawatl and are real Nawatl names, but when they get out into memes or circles, they take on a whole new meaning. Okay, so the meme that's very popular is apapachar. Okay, so right, so regardless of its con el alma, exactly. Regardless of, so you have the word patsoa and pachoa now, which is usually to squish something, and maybe it was used for massage if you repeatedly squish it, right? Papachoa or whatever. But there's nothing in the word that means soul, right? There's if you study the Nawatl worldview, there's not one word that means soul. It's compartmentalized into different kinds, ihiyot and all these things. So there's not one word that means soul. It's not even in that word if you try to say it is. All right, so acariciar con la alma, it's got it is this is
no, it's just giving a massage.
Basically, that's it. Aguacatl, right? So people will say, oh, that must mean testicle, right? Aguacatl, because all right, so maybe there's a town, let's just suppose there's a town where they refer to the male testes as aguacatl, and that's very possible, right? So Nawas sometimes are very indirect. Yeah. And there is that connection being made sometimes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that when people saw the fruit, they named it after the testicles. It's also possible that, in a lot of these cases, that first people saw that you have your own word for testicles, and then to be kind of like, when it becomes a taboo word to say it out loud, you look for another way to say it, right? Indirectly, right? In Huasteca, you say nototo, right? Meaning my little bird, or nohuilo, right? Referring to the other kind of bird, right? There's all these kind of things you could use. And so you could do the same thing with private parts. So, saying no waka would just mean saying these are my, my things, but referring to the tree. Not necessarily that people saw a tree and then called it that. So you can have...
Yeah, well, it's like in English calling testicles nuts, right?
Right.
It's like you don't look at the word nuts and say, oh, did you know that nuts, comes from the word for testicles? It's like, no, it's the other way around. It was just a word that was used.
Exactly. And no one would make that because
like slang.
We know English, so it's obvious to us. But because, now it's not as well known to others, it's easy to follow that. And then there's the most popular one, which this one I've seen it not just in Mexicano circles, but also in Mexican or Hispanic or whatever you want to call it, Chicano fraternities, where they have to give each other secret names. There's some of them are doing it in Nawatl now. And so I see the word Yautl be popularized in that space as a real Nawatl word, but everyone wants to use it as only meaning warrior, when the meaning of Yautl is more generally to enemy. And so you build words upon that to build everything else, right? Yaoyotl, right? Enemy-ness, meaning war, right? And then from there you have all these different words that can mean warrior, like Yautecatl, person who lives or is from the war place. Yaukiski, the one who went to the war. And there's a bunch of other ones, but there's a distinction there. Sometimes you see but in all those words, you do see the word yao, but it's part of the construction of it. Yao by itself wouldn't usually refer to a warrior, usually be referred to your enemy.
It is attested as a name in early colonial time, though. So I guess it would maybe be a little bit weird
to call
your son enemy. So I don't know. I think that probably that's not too far fetched to also say that it may have like the general meaning of warrior. But it's not like it's true. It's not the most usual word for warrior.
It's not the most meaning. Yeah, it's not the most common meaning for it. And there's some varieties in Puebla that still maintain Yautl as your enemy. I've seen that in translations, modern varieties. Then again, Magnus has a great list of Nawatl names that are official, real Nawatl names located in documents. And just look at the way that Nawas named each other.
Yeah, that's true. They do have some names that are fairly despective.
Yes. So there's a guy who was named Old Dirty Yellow Old Breech Clout. The Mashtlat who's old.
Yeah, that was my rap name, by the way.
How would you have that? Little Fish is the name of little kid sometimes. Can you even he has no friends. That was someone's name. He has no friends. He's all alone. but where did he come from?
That's awesome.
Where did he come from? That's another name that you had. And so we think every name has to be a powerful warrior, but a lot of names are silly and funny. You got to think about.
Well, one of my favorite historical names is Mashishkatsin.
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah. The wetter of himself. Yeah.
Yeah, he who pees himself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw one theory that might be something about how they were viewed in their birth. Like if during their birth they somehow had pee, maybe he was called that, or Cuitlawa, maybe he was born with a little bit of excrement on him, and maybe that's why he was named Cuitlawa. I'm not really sure about all those, but you can have all sorts of names in Nawatl.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Well, going through my family tree, I have an ancestor whose parents were named Akat and Xochitl. And when they were baptized, like pretty general names, right?
Well, they're day names. They're date names.
They're day names.
Yeah.
So Xochitl and Akat. And then when they were baptized, they were given the names like Inez and Jose. And so on the records, he's listed as Jose Akat, and she's Inez Xochitl. And then their daughter, who was like my 14th great grandmother or something like that, they gave her the name Isabel Xochitl Akat. So they combined like the names of her the original names of her parents as her new last name. So it was Isabel Xochitl Akat. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But they're very, simple names, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's not always magic.
So one of my, it doesn't always have to be like, when a lot of times when you see people get Nawatl names, they usually pick them for themselves. And they usually pick the most ostentatious name that they possibly can, right? So they'll name themselves like Tlacaelel Huitzilopochtli Cuauhtémoc or something. When in reality, you probably would have been named like Akat, something very simple.
Yeah, but the true meaning, everybody knows that the true meaning of Akat is reed that flies into the heart of the conqueror.
There you go. Of course. The only thing I will say though is that historically, the Maya lords all had those ostentatious names. It's like it's not just what's your favorite animal. It was all of them. Yeah, it was like spear thrower, owl, jaguar. Throw in three animals
spear thrower, owl.
Throw in three names in there that are awesome animals. Jaguar, claw of the night. They did have the Maya lords, trying to keep themselves in power. They did have these big ostentatious names, but I think they took those when they took power.
Warrior. Yeah, the warrior who was named Born into Fire. And he was the general of the spear thrower owl, right? And he just went down and just carved a path.
Yeah, that's
through Maya territory.
Incredible history. It's not often talked about, but yeah, there's a lot in there. Then
so there's one word. Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was gonna get to Ixachilan, but I don't know if you were gonna get to that right now.
Well, that was gonna be the next word. I was just gonna say I want to end on this one word. So when I got involved in the Mexicayot, I bought this book called Juicio a España. I got it right here. It was written by a guy named Xoconochtlet, who's famous for leading all the protests in Europe for trying to get the feathered headdress of Moctezuma returned to Mexico, right? So Xoconochtlet wrote this book, and in it he mentions this word Ixachilan, and I was like, I've never heard of that word. And he claims that it means that it's the name of the Americas, right? Both North and South. Just that the Western Hemisphere in general, the Americas were called Ixachilan. And in my research, I traced it to a man named Juan Luna Cárdenas, who appears to have been the inventor of this word in the 1950s or 1960s. He wrote a book called The Prehistory of America. And he actually has a connection to the pueblo that Magnus's, where you did your research, I believe, in Hueyapan. Juan Luna Cardenas went down there and interacted with the people there, but he was the person who invented this word Ixachilan. So I want you to take it away, Yan. What do you think about that word?
I'll start with all the dictionaries in the beginning had words for, refer to everything. You have your Semanawak. And those words were written down and they were never hidden or excluded. And there was no reason to hide them. So if it just didn't exist before this Cardenas person, as far as we can tell, was the first one to use it. I believe they're trying to make it from the word Ixachi and Tlan. And Ixachi meaning everything, and like the place of everything or something like that. Ixachi being an adverb though. And I don't think you can put Tlan at the end of adverbs. Magnus, you can explain.
No, it's true. Yeah. So as you say, we've talked about the locative endings, and the Tlan, it goes on nouns, and the Ixachi is not a noun. So that's not how you would make a toponym in Nawatl.
So that word just does not work at all.
It doesn't work in that sense, but I guess it works if people use it and they like to use it. But it's not a word I've ever encountered Nawatl speakers using in that sense.
So even today, is Semanawak used commonly by modern speakers?
Not commonly, but occasionally. I hear Tlaltipactli more common.
Tlaltipactli.
Like for the entire Earth planet. Yeah. And maybe Semanawak more like Mexico or like the world. It is used for the world as well, I think.
So could it have been used in I believe the Romans had this view of the known world? Could it have been used that way? Semanawak, instead of just meaning a planet or the world, as far as, the worldview of the Nawa people, using Semanawak to refer to as the known world, just basically what they knew of. I'm just spitballing.
Yeah, I think that would be the logical way of using it, because why would you include the part you don't know? And how would you do that? I don't know. I think, it's the sem, which means all or one or united or full, suggests that it has the meaning of everything that's around the lake, or Anawag is close to the water, right? Everything that's close to the water, and then, what isn't?
Yeah, I'm not a prescriptivist either. I wouldn't tell people what they have to say or what they have to use. But for me, it's very easy to use Semanawak if you wanted to refer to the Americas, if you had to fit that in. And then we have Tlaltipactli, which everyone uses to mean the world, like the rest of the world. So you have the inclusive Tlaltipactli, and you could use Semanawak if you wanted to in a more restrictive sense, like that. But at least both of those are words that have been around for generations and could really do come from the ancestors.
Yeah,
and which most Nawatl speakers, I think, would probably understand, whereas Ixachitlan they wouldn't.
I'm just not sure how Ixachitlan then became Ixachitlan with an L afterwards, but it might be pronunciation of people from back then who didn't speak Nawatl.
Yeah, I've also seen it as Ixachilatlan, Ixachitlan, Ixachilan. I've seen a lot of different variations of it. But Ixachilan, I know specifically, comes from Juan Luna Cardenas in his book.
Yeah, I would guess that's the original one. And then when you have trouble hearing it or don't know how to represent it, sometimes you might misspell it. Then again from there is Ixachitlan or something. Adding the tlan again already when it already has tlan.
Well, cool, guys. I want to thank you both for joining us on this very special episode of Tales from Aztlantes, episode number 20, the final episode of season 1. We're going to take a little break over the next few weeks as we record new episodes, line up new interviews, get more research done, and we'll be back to get in everybody's brains. Do you have, I know you have a website and a YouTube channel. Yan, would you like to promote those?
I've got in Spanish, Canal Nawatl, and the English version, the Nawatl channel, where I'm posting lessons. Everyone can, they're free, obviously. Everyone can subscribe, watch them, check them out. And Nawatl Tapasoli, which is an organization I work with, where we promote on teaching the Nawatl language as fluently. Not just teaching words, but we try and focus on communication and using it in real life with people. So Nawatl Tapasoli.
And it's great, by the way. All of the classes from your guys is fantastic. I take classes with Diego, and that guy's awesome. Yeah. So I recommend anybody who wants to learn Nawatl to check out your organization. And you also have your book, Learn Nawatl, Language of the Aztecs and Modern Nahuas. Now in its second edition. You could buy that on Amazon, or I'm assuming you could have your local bookstores order it. As well.
This one's not the most linguistic book, but I wanted to make it as something for the people, for the community, where it's not as linguistically heavy. It's more about exercises and getting you to practice the patterns of the language, which when I started now, that was totally lacking. So yeah, everyone check that out if anyone interested in learning Nawatl, which I hope more people do.
Well, I highly recommend the book. I am by no means fluent, but I can tell you with using your organization's tools and this book, I speak a lot more than I used to, and I feel more comfortable with it. And Magnus, you have a blog. What would you care to plug your blog, sir?
Well, it's Nawatl Studies .blogspot.com, and it's just my different sort of reflections about Nawatl that I think might be more interesting for people to read about in blog format than as a scientific article going through peer review and all those things. So it's sort of an outlet for my ideas that aren't necessarily publishable in article format.
Well, speaking of published, are you converting your dissertation into a book? Is that something we could look forward to?
Yes. I hope very much that within a couple of years, I think I'm planning to send it to the press later this month, and then peer review and everything. So it'll probably be at least a year or two before it's anywhere near where anyone can read it. But it's in the works. Definitely.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank both of you for joining me. And Magnus, I know you're in Denmark, so thank you for doing this.
Yeah, I'm going back to bed.
Your well-deserved sleep. Thank you, Yan. I really appreciate it. Timoy tase. Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoy tase. Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timoy tase.